It must be okay, sorry, there's this hiccups, technological hiccups. Yes, what this photo represents, those who are old enough remember the Apollo 13 and that message that came from far away, Houston, we have a problem. Now, they had a problem that needed to be sorted in 2 stages. And what I will be presenting today is similarly to be eventually implemented in 2 stages. But that's not only that, because these astronauts have seen planet Earth as their only haven. And so do we. We have to be remembered that we don't have any other planet. We have one civilization, and we have one system, democratic system, that has been tested over, say, 200-300 years, that is now in serious problem. This deep problem of democracy can only be resolved if we face it straight forward and in plain terms. And I'm going to be rather avoiding political correctness, let's put it this way. So the subject of my presentation is proposing almost a new system of democracy, which I call consensual presidential democracy, of which the key element is citizens' Senate. So I think that democracy is in deep crisis. Let me present just 6 elements of that crisis. It starts with political corruption, and we have a good evidence just this month in the British politics what that really means. Political corruption leads to clinging to power, not only in South Africa or not only in Russia, but also in Britain. There are MPs in the British Parliament that have served for over 40 years. Okay, they've been elected democratically, but the sheer fact that the same people can treat the MP position as a job is rather disconcerting. In other countries, this has led to the creation of political dynasties. And the Bushes are one example. The Kennedys, even more so, or the Clintons. No wonder that an average voter sees the politicians as them, whereas us, the citizens, are on the sidetrack. That is obviously a very fertile ground for the rise of populism, as we have seen in America, where, for instance, people like Trump during the election said, well, they're all the same, meaning Clinton. That is sometimes termed as political symmetry. That wave of populism leads to a further disillusionment of the electorate and the political apathy. And that's the state of democracy as we have it right now, showing deep cracks, which needs to be very fastly amended, rectified. But we have another problem, that we don't live in ordinary times. We live at the time of unprecedented civilizational change. And let me illustrate it on these 2 examples. First of all, I would refer to the pace of change in many areas, including politics, which is almost exponential. If you want any proof, look at these 9 areas of human activity: social, ecological, technological. They all show in the recent decade or even years exponential change. we only need to think about our mobile phone. What has happened in the last 10 years, that it has become not only indispensable, it starts to controlling us. What I would like you to remember from this slide alone is one thing, that what took a decade, perhaps a few years ago, now it takes a year. So when you are planning some important changes, whether it is to be in politics, in economy, and so on, remember that the change happens much, much faster than before. And we will have to implement deep reform of democracy when this change takes place, like, for instance, technological unemployment. The second aspect of which we have to consider is that there are at least eight man-made existential risks, of which climate change, of which so much was being talked about at the beginning of the month, and the control of AI, both have a tipping point about 2030. So just 9 years. If you look at this summary of those 8 existential risks, altogether, they amount to roughly 20% of probability that we as humans may be extinct by the end of this century. But people like the late Stephen Hawking or the former astronomer royal Sir Martin Rees think that the chance is just 50-50. That chance by 2050 may be just 50% of us being extinct by the end of this century. And therefore, for those who may be surprised that I've spent the last 10 years mainly in the area of artificial intelligence, that I'm talking about democracy. But I strongly believe that the only hope that we have, that we can control both those man-made existential risks and the survival of our civilization, is a deep reform of democracy. And that's why I'm talking on this subject today. So we need not only a deep reform of democracy, but we need to do it very fast indeed. Before I go into how to do that, or how I propose that can be done, I would like to summarize 4 root areas which need rebalancing, because I think apart from those elements of the deep crisis of democracy that I mentioned, these 4 areas determine that our democracy is in such a bad shape. The first one is the need to rebalance rights with responsibilities. And look at that. We are all familiar. We all fight for justice, equal representation, and say freedom. But how rarely do we ask questions like whose values prevail, which actually determine the kind of justice? Or is everyone's vote equal? It's a horrendous question. People stay away from it. I don't have an answer for this, but I am brave enough to ask. Of coronavirus, a very good example of what freedom means or what it shouldn't mean. Is it free to infect others? So what I would say that sometimes freedom and sovereignty must be constrained. Why? Because there is one value that trumps anything else, and it is life, life itself. Therefore, to move forward and improve democracy, probably we have to start with rebalancing the rights with responsibilities. The second area is the need to rebalance the power of majority versus minority. And those familiar with the fathers of enlightenment perhaps remember this. Assumed to be said by Jeremy Bentham, but some people say something different, that democracy means creating happiness for the greatest number of people. Churchill was great favorite of this approach, and this was an excuse, for instance, for the bombardment of Dresden. Yes, which is a sober reminder that it can backfire if you misinterpret it. Why, in this context, I'm talking about this? Because greatest happiness for greatest number of people means that not all, but some people will not be happiest, and they constitute the minority. It's just nearly 200 years ago that Alexis de Tocqueville said that democracy is tyranny of the majority. And sometimes we can see it. We can even see it in the British Parliament today, that the 80-seat majority gives the party, the ruling party, the assumed right to do whatever it wants. I put a question mark, not proposing any solution to this right now. The third area that needs rebalancing is the power between the center and the local government. Perhaps it's best seen from the perspective of a federation. Essentially, Britain, the UK is a federation, but what we need is a shallow federation, a minimal state, as some people call it, with only defense, foreign affairs, police, and the judicial system at the center. And the fourth area that needs rebalancing is the balance of power between the governed and the governing. I think this is the most crucial one, and I'll be concentrating on this alone in the rest of my presentation, because if this is rectified, then all the other problems, in my view, can also be sorted out. How it looks now. We are talking about the power of the voters. Really, what does it mean? Politicians are afraid of that one day where they are accountable. It's the day of the election. But this is the only day where they are accountable. What happens over the next 4 years or so? They are almost not accountable for anything that they do. There's often a lifetime career, which can lead to corruption. And again, this month just proves, in the British politics at least, but not only in British, if you look worldwide, you can see many examples of exactly that, what lobbying leads to, especially during the pandemics, the awarding of contracts for vaccines and so on. The consequences of that is that any bad legislation usually cannot be stopped before the next election. Think about the HS2, right? What a fallacy to even think about proposing a system of transport that will, in 20 years' time, deliver the speed of the trains that were running with that speed 20 years ago. I mean, this is preposterous. And any sensible expert would say that it should have been stopped. Now the government has stopped part of it, acknowledging that this is absolute rubbish. But thankfully, it didn't withdraw the money, because the money should have been awarded to the North, rightly so, but not under such a pretense that the trains will be running faster and we'll gain 15 or 20 minutes time between London and Birmingham. So if we had the politicians' accountability over the 4-year period, we could stop such a decision or even propose a new legislation. So this is what we would require from the improved system. So, but how would we deliver such a deep reform of democracy fast? I would suggest to start it from the very bottom. And the rock bottom, who is at the rock bottom? Us poor citizens. but this is from us that the power of governance comes from. We have a direct mandate to change democracy. So what follows from that is that we have also the right to have a continuous accountability of politicians. But that can only be achieved by, you probably guessed that, by merging direct and representative democracy. And that would be my first stage of improvement, comparable to what happened to the Apollo 13, when they first had to seal off certain holes in the Apollo space shuttle, and then think about how to land on Earth. So this is our first stage. And in that stage, I would suggest to follow 4 principles. The first one is not to demolish the system. Why not? Because we simply haven't got the time to build a new one. If there had been a superb system that would serve us better than the existing one. Consequently, we should start small, but make fast changes. Just to remind you that the pace of change is almost exponential. We also need to use the existing components, not to reinvent the wheel. We may add 1 or 2 new components, but the core should stay as it is. It should be only strengthened. And finally, the outcome of that should be the restoration of real primacy of voters' will over politicians, over the whole parliamentary term. The only element that really is needed in that to bring this first stage to completion is the creation of a new institution, which I call the Citizen Senate. And the example that I will give is suitable for UK and Germany right now, but there may be other countries as well. I use specifically the UK example because I know it better, to avoid any errors. What may surprise some people is that what we have since 2015 is a petition system that was set up thanks to the coalition government between the liberals and conservatives. That petition system over the last 6 years has been working rather remarkably well on the surface. There have been 50,000 petitions, of which 13,000 were valid. But of those 13,000 petitions, only 1 became law. And some of you may remember that. That was the tax on tampons. So that is this. The petition system exists. And as you can see, this is an element of direct democracy. People may be surprised that in the representative democracy that we have in the UK, we also have an element of direct democracy. The problem is that it doesn't work. It's a fig leaf for the politicians because they can pretend that the citizens can do or propose whatever they want. And then the government, like a king, will perhaps with its absolute power or decree say, all right, we agree. They agreed once at the parliamentary level. So that is the problem, and that needs to be rectified. So what I would propose is that using the existing system, you just raise the number of the signatures needed for a petition to 5% for the major petition, like changing the law or stopping a decision by the government. That would require 2,500 of millions of signatures. I would like to remind you that among those 13,000 petitions, there was one in 2017 to stop to have the second Brexit referendum. It had 4.5 million signatures. And what happened? Precisely nothing, because the government had the absolute majority, and it said no. So in this scenario, it wouldn't make any sense for petition, like say for a second referendum, to go to the parliament, because the result will be as it is. And therefore, we have to create a new institution, which I call as Citizens' Senate, which is modeled roughly on citizens' assemblies. That there have been 215 so far worldwide, including the Irish Citizens' Assembly, about which I'll talk a little bit later. The difference between a Citizens' Senate as a full chamber of a bicameral system would be that this Senate would operate only if there is a petition having more than 5% of the voters supporting it. And then this session would be open, for which a set of randomly selected citizens will be chosen. They will be advised by lawyers and experts. And the difference between an ordinary citizens' assembly and this one is that the decisions of this Senate would be binding. So if they, of course, gain the 50% support, then the decision, the government decision will be stopped. Or if there is a proposal for a new legislation, that legislation coming from the Citizen Senate would have the power of a draft legislation. So the parliament will have to act on it, and would only reject it with a 50%, with a qualified majority of 50% of the voters in the last election, taking part in the last election. And that's the major change, because even if there is a majority government like now, it wouldn't be able to reject such a petition. And that's what I mean by strengthening the existing system. As you can see, the only new element is the Citizens' Senate. We even had citizens' assemblies in the UK. But this, what I'm proposing, would be new, or would be changing the role of Citizens' Assembly. So that's how it might work. Now, how to make it happen the UK way? Well, start with a petition, because we already have a petition system. And we could have a petition like set up a citizens' assembly to decide on the introduction of a semi-permanent citizens' senate. Now, this is the biggest hurdle, because the parliament could simply reject it, as it has so many petitions. But the problem is, if the parliament rejects such a petition, it will be a blatant confirmation that the politicians only think about themselves. They do not think about restoring democracy to its proper level. And that would be an ammunition for the next election, where the opposition could take this as a challenge and almost as a promise that if we come into parliament, we will implement that system. So the government may think twice before rejecting it. If for some reason they would support it, then there would be a citizen assembly, not the citizen senate, that would debate it, and it could still fall theoretically, but I think the citizen assembly would support it, and therefore it would, since it would be a binding decision, the parliament would then act to create a citizens' senate with a new petition system. Is it possible? If you think what happened in Ireland in 2012, where 3 laws were debated by the Citizens' Assembly, and 2 years' time, they changed Ireland beyond recognition, that's what may happen here. So don't be so pessimistic. just believe in what is possible. So that was the first stage. That's the putting a plaster on the Apollo 13th containers. Now we are coming to the more important stage, the second stage, where we want to create almost a new system of democracy, a consensual presidential democracy. We will have already a rigorous petition system. We will have the Citizens' Senate, but we will need the third element, and this is the putting a president or the head of state at the top of a consensual system of governance. That all be part of what I call consensual presidential democracy. And within such a system, which is primarily being governed by consensus, and that's why the name consensus in the name of the democracy that I am proposing, all parties would agree on three time horizon policies. The long term, very long term, will be fundamental values that all parties agrees to: freedom, equality, and so on. And the medium term will be the generation agreements on policy direction, free health service, or transport. If we had, for instance, this medium term policies as the joint policies of both parties, we wouldn't have such a dramatic changes between the elections as they are now. And then there are short-term policies within the term of the parliament, for instance, related to taxation. Now, how can we govern in the new system of democracy with the president as an arbiter? So far, you can see that we have merged the direct and representative democracy by bringing the president into the play. We are adding the third type of democracy, the presidential democracy. So we can combining three most important types of democracy into one. But the crucial difference is that this type of democracy will be run on consensus, with the president having an absolute power as an arbiter. So how it would run? Obviously, there will have to be a proportional representation system. Therefore, in Germany or in Europe, that's not a problem. They already have mostly coalition government, as we can see in Germany, tri-party coalition. If we had it in the UK in 2019, this is what the parliament would look like. The Conservative Party would be in the minority with 288 votes and would need a coalition partner. So you can see it already. But in the future, that would be the norm. So there will be an election, a proportional representation election, and there will also be an election for the president. Once the parliament has been formed, it will elect the majority party would elect its leader as the vice president. And the opposition party likewise will select its leader as the vice president. So in effect, we'll have a triumvirate, almost like in the Roman Empire, right? But obviously, it's only in the name. These three people are essential for countries to survive the cataclysmic changes that we will be experiencing, especially this decade. And what we see with the pandemics is just a preemptive strike, so to speak, that thankfully forces us to prepare for such uncertain times. So these three, this triumvirate would make very fast decisions, will be able to make very fast decisions. That's the key essence of it. The president would elect the would appoint the prime minister, who would then, sometimes with the help of the president, chair a coalition government. If there is a problem, then obviously the president would help to form that coalition. But he will have also a role in bringing the legislation to fruition. He will help to form a coalition for a legislation, because even a coalition government may not have enough votes to get it through. Why? Because it will require 50% of those voting in the last elections. So the MPs representing at least 50% of the voting in the last elections. And that's where the president may be very helpful. And that's why the name of the new type of democracy that I'm proposing is consensual presidential democracy. Now, the final question is how to make it happen in Britain, because in Europe, in the European Union, I think the changes are not fundamental. It's rather the will of strengthening what already exists here. We have a much more serious problem how to implement it, especially in the second stage. But don't forget that we live in very uncertain times, and what we need is a constitutional convention. And Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling emphasize, Tony Blair, all Labour politicians, as happens, all emphasize the need of such a constitutional convention, but not only to sort our problems, but to keep Britain together. So those skeptics that think, wow, this is phantasmagoria, it will never happen, you better think twice or be optimistic. This crisis may actually be the breeding ground for something good to happen. So I would end this presentation with this advertisement for those who want to know more. You can always look for details in my book, Democracy for a Human Federation. Thank you. Now, Brendan, you have to get back. Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I wouldn't recommend much use of the term triumvirate, but of course, both the Roman triumvirates ended up with the members murdering each other. And that, I think, it's not
that was
the
model.
One question that I didn't understand, how is the president elected under this system?
Well, I write about it in my book. I would use the French model. Yes. So if the president gets 50% of the votes, he becomes the president. If not, then it's a second round. But I would reform that, saying that not just two candidates would take part, but so we'll go to the second round, but those who would gain at least 20% plus one. So you always have four candidates, at most four candidates in the second round. Obviously, this is a proposal, and this is a lesser caliber of decision to be made on how to elect the president.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's absolutely central, the question of how you elect the president, isn't it? Given the powers that you're giving to this president, it's absolutely vital how he or she is elected.
Yes, I would go for that two-round system, the French system, and hence two-round system. People may have other views, but I think what it does, although this is not an ideal, and I don't think, by the way, that there is an ideal electoral system. Every electoral system has its flaws. The problem is to select one that has a minimum of the sort. For instance, the Israeli representative democracy and proportional elections are an example of how it shouldn't be done. The Irish system is much better. So there is plenty to choose from. And I'm not saying that, for instance, the systems that I'm proposing in my book are ideal one. It's just for a debate. I give pros and cons. And the same goes for the president. But I wouldn't go for the first past the post as it is right now, unless it has got 50% of the votes.
We've had two questions which I want to put together because I think they do have a common root. One saying, which you probably recognize, that there are problems in the United States and this country, but it's only those two countries which have got a fundamental problem with democracy. The European situation, the rest of Europe, is perhaps, it might be argued, within the general spectrum of messy democracy. That you're proposing something which might or might not be necessary for the United Kingdom, but isn't necessary for the rest of Europe. And secondly, a related point that because the United States and the UK have got these fundamental problems, those problems are going to make anything along the lines of your proposals impossible. How would you respond to those related points?
Yes. First of all, in Europe, I think the implementation of such a proposal would be much easier. In the European Union, I think. We are part of Europe, whether we are not part of the European Union, but we are part of Europe. Well, I'm talking specifically about European Union, because there is already a representative democracy, there are proportional representation, and there are coalition governments. And the Citizens' Assembly much wider adopted than in the UK. By the way, in the States, there have been at least 100 Citizens' Assemblies in various states, and some at the state level, and some were delivering quite stunning results, some surprising results. Regarding the feasibility of implementing such a proposal in the United States, I would say straight away a fantasy. It's impossible. I am deeply, deeply concerned about the American politics, about the whole electoral system, and not only that, how it has been corrupted. And the best evidence is what President Biden has been trying to do to work towards ascertaining the right to vote for those who have been deprived for voting, mainly the Black minority and all the minorities. I mean, the United States is a separate case, and this is a tragic thing, because this is a cornerstone of modern democracy, and it has found itself in such a situation because it hasn't modernized at all. The amendment system might have been good, but it's a way of putting a plaster on a system that is collapsing. And we could see it on the 6th of January, what happened. Regarding the United Kingdom, I'm much more optimistic. I think to some extent, although it sounds preposterous, the worse the situation is right now, the sooner we will have the right and deep reform of democracy. And I'm thinking primarily about the danger of splitting the United Kingdom into its constituent parts. I will go even that far as to say that what incidentally Nicola Sturgeon said yesterday, that she's planning the referendum latest by 2023. And I think she will do that, and that the government will agree. But if the referendum is for yes, I think that she will not be so irresponsible as to split Scotland of the United Kingdom, but to bargain for precisely that, constitutional convention, re-establish the relationship between the constituent parts of the UK in a different way. So I'm rather optimistic, although at the moment I must be in a terrible minority.
Yes, but there are important political forces in the United Kingdom to whom the maintenance of the United Kingdom is either a matter of indifference or even they're hostile to it. I really can't believe that Nicola Sturgeon, if she manages to get a majority for independence, would renege on that. I don't think it will be politically conceivable. We have the prospect of Northern Ireland ceasing to be part of the United Kingdom, a real possibility. And there are some people who would say that that might be no bad thing. Within the Conservative Party, there are a number of strains of English nationalism, which would be indifferent or perhaps even welcoming of Scotland's leaving the United Kingdom, because they think it will guarantee for them an English Conservative majority indefinitely. So you may be right that circumstances will force this rethink that you're talking about, but I don't think that the prospect of the breakup of the United Kingdom is quite the trump card. Trump, I won't mention the word, the winning card that you think it is, because there are strains within the British political elite who are perfectly happy or at least acquiescent in the breakup of the United Kingdom.
I'm afraid I have to agree with you that that may be an over-optimistic view on the Scottish plans, and they may, the government perhaps may, if it gets the yes referendum supporting the exit, that they may actually do it. If I were a Scot, I would have thought twice. Especially in these fast-changing circumstances, not only on the British stage, but worldwide, whether it is wise to get it alone when there is so much that unites Scotland and Britain. It's, but on the other hand, I would only bring forward the example of Czechoslovakia. In 1996, the two countries decided to split, and the Czechs thought, wow, finally we got rid of them because we had to finance them. And what happened now? After 20 odd years, the GDP level of Slovakia and the Czech Republic there's a 10% difference. They made enormous progress, although there is a relatively smaller country, Slovakia, than the Czech Republic. So Scotland could survive. I think those who say that if there's no oil anymore in the North Sea, that's it for Scotland, absolutely not, because the future economy may be based on the digital economy, on the services, and a lot of digital industries are in Scotland. Even the space industry may be based there. So the verdict is still to be awaited. But you may be right, Brendan, that once they have won, they may decide to leave, yes.
Well, it would seem to me slightly odd to erect your whole political philosophy around independence, and then when you've won a referendum on it, not to accept it. I think that would be a quirky outcome.
Yes, that's a very benevolent appreciation of the Scottish mood. They may think otherwise. You're right, but I think rationally, not emotionally, rationally, that would have been a better outcome overall for all the constituent parts of the UK to stay together and rejoin the European Union, of course.
Yes. We've had one or two questions to which I've put counter questions. So I'll wait until we get a response on that, particularly about the future of American democracy. But I do want to ask one last question of you, which does relate to the question of the feasibility of what you're proposing, how we get from where we are now to where we want to be. There's the question of consensual values, which you mentioned. You said that there is a consensus among some values of equality, of freedom, of intergenerational equity. Is not the stuff of political debate, particularly in this country, different views of what constitutes freedom? You mentioned a caricatural and extreme example of it, that the people who don't want to wear masks claim to be doing so often in the name of freedom. And what constitutes equality for some people is rather different to what is meant by that term by others. Isn't there the danger that when you have a system which is so geared around consensus that in fact there's no political choice because everybody has to be voting for the same thing?
I have to agree entirely with what you said, and this is a dire situation in Britain, that so little is being talked about primary values, not just rights, but values which preceded the rights, how they actually manifest themselves in real life. Like, for instance, this relation to pandemics, how people not only do not vaccinate themselves, but almost blatantly get rid of their masks, provoking others to some extreme reaction. So, but that is in my view, the consequence of perhaps 40, 50 years of media campaigns, using social technical means to get people disinterested in politics. I remember in the early 80s, right? You walk down the street during the election time, and there were posters in people's windows. Vote Liberal, vote Conservative or Labour. Where are they now? Where are the people who are putting up the British flag during the election? I mean, these are very simple symbols of complete disengagement of the public from the values on which we have to sort out, on the basis of which we have to sort out our lives and how we interrelate. And even BBC, which is such a well-established organization worldwide, does not devote enough space to this. It doesn't want controversy. Like, for instance, I mentioned, is everybody's right to vote equal, or should it be equal? I have no answer, but I would ask that time and time again. Give it, because the equality of the vote, which is, in my view, a misconception from the French Revolution, which the Labour Party essentially in the last 20, 30 years rectified a little bit and came to agree with the Conservatives. Yes, you are equal at birth, the equality of opportunity, but not the equality of outcome. If it comes to elections, when you come to deciding whether Britain should exit the European Union or not, you give exactly the same right to everyone, irrespective of the ability to make such a decision. It's a very fundamental question and it needs to be resolved. And I don't have a quick fix for it, but I think it is responsible that it is not being asked, because it's being thought to be politically incorrect.
Well, those people who are in favor of first past the post are very happy with the idea that
Yes.
people's vote should be, and they have arguments on their side. It's not a completely absurd idea that in a representative democracy, first past the post does have advantages of decision making, and also the ability, when people are unhappy with one particular set of choices, to go to the other party at the next election, and that other party will have an opportunity to pursue a different policy. As a separate question, can I just say, I think you're slightly exaggerating when you say there is no accountability between elections. I think HS2 is quite a good example of it. There has been inadequate accountability, but the government have realized, half realized, that they got it wrong. And I don't think in a democracy you can expect that there will be these U-turns all the time because somebody persuades the prime minister that he or she has got it wrong. It has to go in a more incremental, in a more glacial way. But that's just a necessary consequence, it seems to me, of democracy.
Yes, Brendan, you put a lot of questions into one, so
Okay.
I'm not sure whether I'll answer all of them. First past the post. That's the cardinal argument for those supporting it, that it gives strong government. And because if it gives strong government, we have quick decisions. True, but if these are wrong decisions, it's even worse. So that's the first thing. The second one, regarding the possibility of changing the decision if it is wrong during the election. So there is some accountability. Actually, the HS2 wasn't done because the opposition pressed against it. It was done because of Rishi Sunak, unhappy, presumably, with spending over 100 billion, something that is preposterous and uneconomic. So it's the government's self-correction, as it has done several times in the COVID pandemic, where it changed its views so many times that you are lost what it is all about. Not sure that I have answered all the questions that you asked in this particular moment. So if I have missed anything, please let me know.
Yes, I'll come back to it in a moment. But Titus Alexander is asking about the role of democracy, education, in perhaps improving political consciousness and democratic consciousness within the country. You mentioned the role of the media. Are you sure that it's changed institutions which are necessary to improve democratic accountability and democratic acceptance, rather than education and a more thoughtful electorate?
Well, I would start with education, with schools, universities, and I would refer to America for change. If you observe the election, you must be absolutely astounded to see for how many hours people queue up in those elections. Okay, we know why it is. What is the background for it? People are almost desperate to put their vote in the elections. But not only that, if you think about all those parades in America, the clinching to the flag, waving the flag, America. Okay, you may say that Americans are brainwashed, and I think they are much more brainwashed than we are. It's a personal perception. But one thing that is certain, that many more Americans, I think, are patriotic than many more British. But that wasn't like that. I said just 30, 40 years ago, I was walking along some of the streets, and there were plenty of posters during the election campaign. There are even flags, and it all disappears. And that's why the schools, the education system is failing to perhaps instill in the children those values that we are talking about. Is it a shame? I mean, this is, yeah, it's an emotion that going through me, but I can see why we are in such a state, because once these children become voters, they abnegate their responsibility to the state. They think that everything is for grabs. They have all the freedom and no responsibilities. That's why I was talking about the rebalancing, the rights and the responsibilities. That is gone. And especially in the last 30, 40 years, because if you think just after the war in Britain, that wasn't the situation at all, not to mention the war period. It all happened since the late 60s, which the 60s were probably the best period, in the post-war period. And we are now reaping the effects of it.
One of the audience talks about the personality cult of British politics, that many people prefer to vote on the basis of personality, and Johnson perhaps is a beneficiary of this, rather than on the basis of policies. Wouldn't your proposed role for the president give an impetus to a cult of personality, given the central role that he or she would play?
To some extent, this should be like that. We need a figurehead, a real statesman who would represent the nation and will be like a father to the nation. There's nothing wrong with this. And if it is only a maximum two term for a president, and if he is only one of the three, and that his power is always corrected or at least tuned to the wishes of the two opposing parties who are the vice presidents, then there is no danger of the cult like the Mao or Stalin in Russia, because even in America, you have to some extent a better system than here, because the president can be only elected for 2 terms, whereas Boris Johnson could stay with us for another 30 years if he's still going strong.
Well, the voters might have something to say about that. And I think that in spite of all your criticism of the voters, I think at a certain point,
they will be bored.
They'll get fed up with. They'll have heard the jokes before. I think we've dealt with all the questions, but just one final question, I suppose, which is that you talked about a constitutional convention and the way in which some politicians, who you said rather benevolently, I think, happen to be Labour. I don't think they happen to be Labour. I think it's something that at the moment is of much more interest to the Labour Party for electoral reasons. But you didn't mention that the people who are advocating this constitutional convention are people who formerly held important positions, and the people who are unlikely to hold important positions in the future. And I remember very vividly in 1997, the Labour Party, or the years before 1997, were talking about their commitment to proportional representation. And this was going to be part of the modernising agenda. And then when they got their enormous majority under the first past the post system, they decided that actually it wasn't such a bad system after all. And I wonder whether there is going to be, in the present situation of British politics and of British public opinion, I think the two interact with each other unhappily to produce a not always very optimal mix. I don't think there is going to be any plausible commitment by the opposition to a constitutional convention. So I think it's very difficult to imagine that, desirable as your proposals are, that we have a party political structure that can ever deliver it.
Mm. I'm afraid I may agree with you in this sense that if there aren't any catastrophic events in the next few years, then yes, we'll plow on. Major changes only happen because something, as people say, has to be done. even if it's hard to do, and people will, to some extent, suffer from it, they think, well, there is no other option. When things are going relatively benignly, then people wouldn't do any major changes. But this is where we may differ, Brendan, that I think in the next few years, we will have earth-shattering events worldwide, including Britain. So, okay, this is only a projection of some worldview, but as we can even observe or hear today, the speech by the MI6 president, or not the president, the head of the MI6, saying exactly that we live in very dangerous times. So God knows who will be right. We may see in the next 5 years, Brendan.
Yes, but of course, the head of MI6 has every interest in claiming that we're living in dangerous times. We weren't living in dangerous times, he'd be out of a job. So I take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. Well, thank you very much. Well, or is there another question that has come up? I think there is. Have you got a moment to answer?
Yes.
And well, you just applause for the American idea that that two terms is the maximum. It's comparatively recent, of course, because Roosevelt had 3.5 terms.
Because it was the wartime, and there is
no, there was no constitutional bar at the time on having an infinite number of terms as president. There was a constitutional amendment introduced later on. I can't remember if we changed that. Well, somebody said that he lives in Clapham, one of our audience, and that during the last election there are a large number of posters in Clapham, and he wonders whether there are people who live on the Clapham omnibus, and perhaps they're not typical of the British electorate, although the man on the Clapham omnibus is supposed to be typical of the British electorate. Yes. So there's a paradox there that Nicholas MacLean has pointed out. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any concluding remarks you want to make?
Well, I would add to just this last reference. Then when we watch the election campaign reported by BBC or Sky News, we can't see those posters. We can't see the flags. So it's not just in Clapham or in the area that I live in, South London. It's just Britain-wide that people just shy away from hoisting the flag
but no, in Clapham there were lots of posters, according to
that is a phenomenon. Perhaps we should advertise and saying that this is still possible. So let's my final conclusion is that yes, the feasibility, I think, is the crucial question that people may have. How feasible, assuming that this is rational and it doesn't have too many emotional points, because it doesn't. I think this is what needs to be done, even if it is in a slightly different form, because it could be a deep reform of democracy, not just in Britain, because we've been talking only about the British point of view, but the same attitude, the same proposal would apply to the continent, even to the European Union itself, which is in rather not a very pleasant state right now. So regarding Britain, the time will tell how feasible some of those proposals are. I think we'll see if the very idea of citizens' assembly spreads more widely in Britain, and not being confined to cities and some environmental issues, but some important issues. But we simply haven't got the time. We have to remember that everything changes almost exponentially. And I think that this pace of change and the way that the world develops without having a clue where it is aiming for and in which danger and circumstances we are right now, that it will have its impact on decision, even on of the current politicians, to do something not to bring us to the brink of collapse, civilization collapse.
Well, on that cheerful note,
yes,
let's put an end to this evening's event. Thank you very much indeed, Tony. A lot of very positive comments from the audience, which I'm happy to pass on. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And watch out for the next Federal Trust event, which is on the 7th of December, where we'll be talking about some of the same topics of populism and the threat it poses to democracy. I'll be one of the speakers talking about Brexit on that occasion. So thank you very much, Tony. Thank you much.
Thank you
To the audience.
Thank you.